Welcome everyone to Agile Talks by Agile Gurus. I'm your host Rahul Kataria, and today we have our Agile coach Awais Sheikh.
Hey,
Good, good,
Rahul.
good, Awais. All right, so guys, just like every other time, we're gonna put you guys on mute. If you guys have any questions, concerns during our podcast today, feel free to put in the chat, and we'll try to take it. And today's topic is it's a part two of a three-part series. We're talking about story user stories and today we are specifically talking about story points or estimates. So there are a lot of questions people had even in the last podcast. They stayed after the podcast and they asked some questions, so we wrote them down. So we're going to try to address those. But if you have any suggestions or comments on any questions, feel free to engage in the chat column. All right, so we're gonna start with Awais. I'm gonna start with you first. Reha can't make it today, so it's you and me. We're gonna tag team some questions. So Awais, first question is, what are story points or estimates?
Uh, I think most of the people's on the call and people hearing would definitely know that story point is nothing more than it's usually the unit of measure for expressing an estimate for the overall effort that needs to be done to either fully implement a backlog or particular pieces of item in the backlog, right? Usually, the general practice that we do is we estimate story points, align value to each and every item, and uh, usually when we do the estimation, it is done in Fibonacci series. So we'll have 1, 2, 3, 5 points like that. The most important part over here is you know two should take double the amount of time story point with the story point one. So it's about relative estimation, and this is where a lot of people have a challenge transitioning from waterfall into agile, where we compute number of hours into story point. But conceptually, there is a big difference, and that's the reason we do Fibonacci series rather than putting hours or something like that into estimation.
Yeah, um, yeah, absolutely, and especially when you are a new team, it's hard to adapt to that and try to get that concept of how to do story points for
Mhm.
stories. So just be aware that don't try to relate story points to hours.
Yeah.
Right. Nice. All right. Our second question is, why are story points important and what is the benefit? So I'll try to take that away. Chime
Mhm.
in. Feel free to chime in there. So for story points, right? Let's take a look at how we are. Let's say if you're in a Scrum team, and that's not a Kanban for now. Let's take an example. You have a big product backlog. Now, if you groom your stories and put story points, and you have a good idea eventually, not for a new team, but if you have when you have a good idea of these are the story points about this much you can complete in a sprint, and if you have, let's say, next 3 or 4 sprints worth of stories groomed, it gives you an idea of how much stuff you have in the backlog. It gives a good idea to the business team that does my team need more work based on what they have right now. And for leadership, they look at someone's backlog, especially if it's a well-groomed backlog. They look at one team's backlog and say, well, they have a lot of stuff going on. And looking at what they have groomed, looks like it's going to take them for this almost this whole backlog, it's going to take them about 5, maybe 4 sprints based on what they are saying, right? So I think that these are like small benefits for everyone to have those story points and be better at story points. If you are like completely off, it's going to not just harm you, but also like when you're, I don't know if how you report to leadership, but when you're reporting to leadership, leadership won't have good faith in looking at your backlog that you will be able to get all that stuff done within 3 to 4 sprint range. So that's where getting really good at story points and understanding why they're important becomes a key point. Always, do you have anything else to add to that?
I think you hit a couple of good points. Estimation, like keeping the leadership engaged, and then like you can also project the future work, right? So at least from a leadership perspective, they do understand what what is the future work and how much time, just ballparking, they would know how much time the team would take in order to finish all of this backlog items. So
Yeah,
we can manage the WIP better. We can have future items coming in, so they do understand what is the time to market for any new request that we have. That is a very key element in today's world.
absolutely. Yeah, that was a very good point, Avis. Thank you for adding
Mhm.
that. All right, our next question, and I don't think we have a lot of questions today, guys, but our next question is, how do we do estimates? What are estimates? I guess that we covered it. Um, hours/points versus relative estimates. So, all right, Avis is already smiling because we had a good debate about this last week.
Mhm.
I did a few workshops in Capital One and other places. There's an exercise that can help you understand why story points are not equal to hours, right? And I wish we had more time here to do it, and maybe we'll just do a separate workshop. So, guys, if you're interested in learning that and taking it back to your team, I know especially when I had new Scrum Masters joining our team, and when they're trying to help new teams understand why story points are not exactly equal to hours, they were having a very hard time from questions they were getting from people. So this is what, and I'm going to take an example from one of the exercises that we had. So think of it as a relative sizing, right? Like I think someone in the chat mentioned small, medium, large. So think of one story that you have done repeatedly and benchmark it. Let's say it's a 2 or 3 pointer. Now take a look at the other story that's in the backlog when you're grooming it. See if it's a bigger story. When I say bigger, it doesn't only mean like it's going to take more time, but what's the risk involved? What are the, if it's more complicated to do it, not just just taking the same time, but is it more complicated? What kind of risk is involved? Is it more risk, less risk? All those factors will key in to do story points. So one of the examples from the exercise is, think of so you have one story, and I'm just making it up right now. You have one story which says, you need to, as a team or one person, you need to watch a movie for 2 hours. It's still 2 hours, but you're just watching a movie. Versus you have a time bomb to defuse within 2 hours. Now, how would you story point it if these are two stories given to you? Are they same? Because it's still taking 2 hours, right? Is something more complex? Is there some more risk involved in one of the stories? So think of all those different factors that come into play when you're targeting or when you're estimating stories. So that was just one of the examples, but that game will help you kind of understand why don't just consider hours, because at the end of it, it's the human factor that plays a part, right? One story is going to take so much toll on you, and you won't be productive for the rest of the day, versus the other story, which is super easy. You can just do it and you can keep adding more stories for the day, for you or for the team. So that's my take on it. But always, I'm going to let you add more things, and if you want to talk about more about relative estimates, feel free to join in.
Yeah, Rahul, I really like the analogy, when you said watching a movie for 2 hours versus you have 2 hours, you have to defuse a bomb, right? So that's where we talk about complexity. That's where we can talk about risk. So I think I'll also answer one of the questions which is there in the chat. That how do we onboard new teams into doing story point estimations? What we have done in the past is, let's say we have a team and the team does not have any idea about what story point estimation is, how to go about it. They're still thinking in terms of hours. So what we do is, okay, take one task and finish it. What is the simplest task that you can do from the backlog over here? The team will pick up, and then we benchmark that as a 1 point story. Then what we do is, based on that story, you'll relatively estimate the rest of them. The important point, as we mentioned here, it's not only the amount of work, but what is the risk involved in that? What are the dependencies? What are the unknowns? All of those factors. So combined together, then you can have that. Okay, if it is taking twice the amount of time of the first benchmark story, then you point it as 2. If it is 3 times more, you point it as 3, and then gradually you move ahead. So that's a good way how we can start any team into doing story point estimations.
Absolutely. And as I mentioned, if a team is new to it, it's very hard to grasp that whole idea of story points. And
Mhm.
when I have met with new teams, they would ask me questions like, why do we even call it story points? Again, like for me, you can call it bananas for what I care, but like what's the point of doing story points is right. the the end goal, for at least in my head, for the new teams is looking at, if you have 40 stories in the backlog, figuring out how many stories would you be able to fit in each sprint, so you can have like a good estimate of, in this PI or next 4 sprints or 6 sprints, this is the amount of work we can actually deliver. Call it
Mhm.
story points, call it stones, whatever you want to call it, but that's the agile terminology. um, and in that question where it says, could you talk a little bit about team, and which is new to Scrum? And I think Awais touched that a little bit here, but also when a team is new, I guess Awais, you mentioned that they start with 2 days equal to 1 point or something like that, right? I know you and I talked about this last week. So that's how I think a lot of teams start, like 1 day equal to 1 point or 2 days equal to 1 point. And they start with that, but because they don't have any benchmark, any context doing the same thing before. So once they do that a few times, they figure out, all right, this is the type of story, let's call it two, because this is the least risk, least complex, easy to get done within like a day or two. And then starting with that benchmark will, when you start grooming more stories with that benchmark, you will have a better idea. Now looking at the second story, is it a two, is it like almost same, is it
Mhm.
more, is it a three or five? So that all becomes relative after that. um Always, is there anything else you missed or I missed about this?
No, I think you covered for the most part of it. Yeah.
Gotcha. Next question we have is anti patterns. So,
Mhm.
is I know you have been involved lately with a lot of new teams and old teams, and you have seen a lot of anti patterns. So, I'm going to let you talk about that for story points.